military might against the rest of Europe, and then eventually the rest of the world, was truly terrifying to contemplate. And then the Arab Spring, it is true that Gene Sharp did have this influence, and that it was certainly in Egypt and Tunisia. I think it was, you could say that it was predominantly nonviolent, and it might have been able to sustain that even for a longer period of time, perhaps. I don't know if that's clear, but there are other cases, of course. We're now dealing with Bahrain, and where there's a Saudi Iran face-off at a fairly explosive level, all with violence in the background. The Indian-Pakistan relationship has the threat of violence behind its negotiations. And so while I am emotionally very intensely positive toward Gandhi and wanting him to, his legacy to become stronger and stronger, and I also agree with Thomas Merton, who said that war will not stop while we believe it can't be stopped. So it cannot be stopped while we believe it can't be stopped. It will not be stopped while we're not convinced that it can be stopped. And I think, and he's, I think, quite right in thinking that we have this suspicion that peace is a temporary interlude and that something's going to start up again. And so there, I think Gandhi is really important if we could show that it is possible. But there are cases where it's very hard to establish that, in fact, nonviolence would have worked. So this is, very a poignant exchange between Gandhi and Martin Buber about the Second World War, for example. So now I want to go back to these parts here where I think that Gandhi is at his absolute strongest. In other words, I'm not sure that he can win the argument the way we want him to win the argument on the international situation of warring and sometimes paranoid, sometimes countries with long traditions of violence. It's quite discouraging, or sobering, to try to think about how that could work. Where, on the other hand, I think in these four items, and I don't know that I have them exactly how many you had and how many I have, but these are Gandhian for sure, and I think they're all tremendously important and positive to apply as far as we can. And so, I want to draw, this is all an attempt to draw out Joseph. What I have come to, sort of, I don't know how permanently, but at least temporarily, what I've come to is pretty much the Obama speech, Nobel Prize speech, namely that we have to do this case by case, and that there is no single position of violence or nonviolence or it's as complicated as trying to predict which marriages are going to survive and which relationships or whatever. There doesn't seem to be a single criterion for how to react in this situation or that. And I think the point of Obama's speech, which was right out of Reinhold Niebuhr, was that there are situations where sinful people are quite powerful and violent and really can only be stopped by force. I'm not pleased with that position, but when I just watched the whole Civil War again, the Ken Burns, and I'll just finish with this one pro-Gandhi example, namely the difference between the 250-mile march from Ahmedabad to Dandi to do illegal touching of salt to the tongue, and its fabulous positive repercussions. William Tecumseh Sherman went in the march from Atlanta, which he had just burned, to Savannah, 250 miles, and burned everything in his wake, including all the farms, all the houses, just totally devastated all of that area. And that march, with all of its violence lives still in the South in the most painful and, a kind of a testimony to the need for nonviolence and the evil effects of rampant violence. Though, as Shelby Foote said, Sherman was the first completely modern general, because he said, war is hell, therefore do it quickly, get it over with, kill everybody you have to kill, including the people who are growing the food, and win it or lose it and get it over with. So that's a pretty horrific example, both 250 miles, both by these remarkable people. And it seems like that's a case in favor of Gandhi, but I don't know that we could have freed the slaves nonviolently, from what I'm able to find out. So, Joseph, any of these topics that interest you, you should just come and say what you have to say, and then we should try to get to the questions as soon as possible.
Let me ask a practical question. Are we planning to end by 9?
Yeah, we should, because people sort of set their interior clocks, or I think.
Okay, in that case, I think, Robert, if you don't mind,
I don't mind.
I would like to invite questions, and I'll try to weave them in.
If you do, you do, and you don't.
Yeah.
So I'm done with this.
No, each of us has one. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you and I can have, yeah. So if we have only 24 minutes, then I'd rather that we have the discussion that I'm looking forward to. And I will try to weave them into some of Robert's questions. Yeah. So, yes.
I'm really interested in Gandhi's approach, or perhaps what you have to say about the relationship between religion and politics, especially in America with Christianity, which it has played many roles in the past, both I think the positive and progressive role with civil rights with Martin Luther King, and also since Reagan with the eruption of the so-called moral majority, it's kind of played a more repressive effect.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what sort of spiritual reserves do you see still lying dormant in the Christian tradition, which may help to sort of repoliticize American liberals even, to sort of taking action on a level that hasn't really taken effect yet. There seems to be a lot of complacency and sort of dismissiveness of the standard forms of government, and democracy doesn't seem to be functioning anymore. Do you think that Christianity has a future in America as sort of way to revitalize the political base in the form that Martin Luther King was able to use it to mobilize, or do you think that it will continue to?
It's a very, very good question, and it would require a sort of presentation unto itself to gauge all the complexities. Let me say 2 or 3 things that might be helpful. First, in response to Gandhi, Gandhi was deeply impressed by parts of Christianity. In fact, when he read the Sermon on the Mount for the first time as a student, as a law student in London, he said, "This is exactly what I've been waiting to express," and he wept. Likewise, Gandhi wept when he saw the Pieta. So he was very, very sensitive to aspects of Christian, the agape, self-sacrificial love, which he distinguished from eros and philia, which are sort of comparable notions of love. So the philosophy of love is quite a complex idea in itself. But in response to the second thing that I would say is that Gandhi was quite aware that religion, precisely because it claims to have a transcendent object, whether you call that God or the divine, or and that this transcendent object somehow is thought by some people to escape rational criticism. Gandhi was very skeptical of that. So Robert and I were having a discussion about how to characterize Gandhi, and Robert thought, with some justification, that Gandhi could be considered a rational humanist. And I pointed out to Robert that, in fact, Gandhi had a very deep prayer life. So whatever his humanism was. It was not a reductive humanism. But I bring that up because Gandhi was quite aware how people could use religion for one's own selfish and very often demonic ends. So our dear Reverend Pastor in Florida, who thinks that he'll somehow be able to tackle the problem of Islam by burning the Quran, is clearly someone who is grandstanding and so on and so forth. That's a trivial but nonetheless quite a consequential example, because you see what repercussions it had. So Gandhi's idea of religion, as I pointed out, was a quite specific one that's moral. He says no religion should escape and should exempt itself from strict moral guidelines. So in a sense, Gandhi's ethical criteria applied to religion, compassion, love, sensitivity to suffering, etc., are sort of acid tests, if he wants, that a religion should meet. And as we were discussing in the other room, when he sees even parts of his tradition that are revered, like the Bhagavad Gita, for example, he doesn't hesitate to say, no, this is not a paean to violence. This is really an allegory about nonviolence. And likewise, he did not hesitate for a moment. In fact, the reason why he was assassinated is because his assassin thought that he was, in a sense, selling out Hinduism because he was taking in ideas of compassion and love from Christianity and Islam and so on. And this, according to, I mean, by the way, this assassin was no hobo. I mean, he was a very deeply educated, within quotes, Hindu, who was the editor of a very respected journal. And shortly after he assassinated Gandhi, and when he came in court, he held a long session explaining exactly why he had assassinated Gandhi. So in a sense, you see two different sides of religion that you are alluding to, and at least in Gandhi's case. And I think there's some justification for that, because the record of religion in our time is not a very positive one on the whole. I mean, sure, there are great figures like Desmond Tutu and Mother Teresa and others, but on the whole, there are as many problematic figures and movements in the name of religion, whether it's in Ireland or in my own country of India, where religious principles are distorted to. So it's very easy, precisely because of the kind of, if you want, the structure of religion, to adapt it for political or other ends. Yeah, Rick.
Following up some of Robert's remarks here, it seems like the effectiveness of Gandhi's completely admirable ethic and philosophy of political action depends on who the opponent is. Mm-hmm. And in some ways it seems as if the British, as critical as he was of the British Empire and of modern Western civilization per se, and it would be interesting to know maybe more about whether there was some nuance in that critique, because that describes certainly the shadow of modern Western civilization, but